sorry. I think I distracted you. I forgot to tell everybody that I was going to record. So sorry. I'm recording
No worries.
now. Surprise.
No, you're doing so much better at this than I would ever be able to do. So thank you. But yeah, our idea was just to have something that would be specific to this level. And so reflecting on what we talked about the last two times, turning to any issues that were important to you, and then thinking about our task for next time, what we can do to really prepare for the next time and where we see this going from this point on, what we'd like to accomplish in the remaining part of the school year, and then what we hope to accomplish during the summer to get ready for changes we might implement in the following school year, the 22-23 school year. So with that in mind, any questions, any issues that came up, any things that you would like to go into in integrated detail?
And I forgot to ask if you guys would, if you could rename yourselves so that I have your school by your name, that would be really helpful to us, because we know that some of you guys have already been doing some of this work. And for some of you guys, this is brand new. And so Dr. Gusky wants to be able to provide the supports to you based on where you are. So if you guys could go in and rename yourself and put your school next to your name, that would be really helpful.
Yeah. And for our discussions here, I'd be really comfortable if we just worked on a first name basis. So Tom is great for our discussions. That'd be terrific. And maybe what I can do too is provide any additional detail on what we're hoping to accomplish between now and our very next meeting. And those are the two elements. The first was to come up with a draft purpose statement from the committee at our school, looking at input from our other faculty, that we would feel comfortable actually printing on the top of the report card. Our idea was that if we have that purpose statement to which we all agree, then we can turn to our policy and practices and talk about how well they align with that purpose. The second was then to consider what particularly non-cognitive or non-achievement indicators we want to report in addition to an achievement grade. We're going to take these two things on as necessary prerequisites before even thinking about reporting according to standards. Oftentimes, the school districts have struggled because they've changed report cards and reported on standards and haven't really considered the purpose. And that always gets them into trouble. That's why we started today's session with the idea of the why always has to come before the what. And so those were the two tasks that we hoped everybody would take on between now and our next meeting about a month from now, to really come up with a draft statement on purpose that you would feel comfortable submitting. We will then share those with everybody. We'll see what common elements are there, and if we can't come up with something that we hope would be applicable district-wide. And then finally, then to look at what process elements we think would be most important. And it could be in your discussions that you will find some process elements that might be, say, more important for K1-2 and another set of process elements for 3 to 5. That would be fine. But we do want to be consistent in this. So once we get these down, then we'll turn to that challenging task of developing rubrics for it. But any questions about that? Any questions about where we hope to go with this or our rationale behind this? Well, see, if there aren't any questions, then I'm going to take this that I've been exceedingly clear in my directions and highly successful in what we hope to accomplish. And everybody is just ready to take on the good work and be on with it.
Dr. Gusky, we actually have a question that was just dropped in the chat. And,
okay.
And so this is something I know that you and I have talked about. So they asked,
Right.
This is from Fairdale Elementary, will our report cards actually change? And I know that you talked about some of the things that have to take place prior to us getting there. And I know you've done some work with, you and your friend have done some work with our Infinite Campus team. So do you want to talk to them a little bit about that and what report
Sure.
cards? Mhm.
Yeah, and Sean is absolutely right. We did have a meeting with some of the folks from Jefferson County that are specialists in Infinite Campus. And we outlined for them some of the changes we'd like to make. And yes, we do think that there are very important changes that need to be made within the current Infinite Campus format. Now, the thing to understand, and I know that we've worked with several districts throughout the state, Infinite Campus was not designed by educators. The report card format was not designed by educators. It was not based on what we know works good with reading. Infinite Campus was designed by software engineers. And so we're bringing to them new ideas that in many cases they haven't considered. But yes, we want to make some very definite changes in Infinite Campus. And that's why I was so insistent on bringing my friend Jerry Swan into this conversation. Because when Jerry and I, about, oh gosh, almost 10 years ago now, began working in this area together, we found it to be impossible to use Infinite Campus to accomplish what we wanted. And so Jerry, on his own, developed a program to sit on top of Infinite Campus, import class rosters from schools to generate an entirely new report card. But here are some of the changes that we incorporated in our new version report card we would like to see important for the Jefferson County version as well. Number one, we want a statement purpose printed on the report card itself. Right there on the top, let's be clear about the purpose. Let's share that with parents. Let's have no mistake about what it is, because all of our policies have to relate to that purpose. We want to put it on the report card. That's number one. Number two, we need to be able to pull out these non-achievement factors and report them separately. We are going to develop rubrics for that so we can communicate exactly what those mean, but we want those to be included on the report card. We're going to carry that over to the permanent record at the elementary level as well. But we need to be clear about that, and we need to be able to report those separately and pull those out from an achievement grade. That has to be there. Absolutely, there's no debate about those. Those two things we need to have essentially built into it, and we just can't accept anything other than that. If Infinite Campus can't do that, then we're going to go around Infinite Campus, period. Now, there are some other additional things that we're going to bring up to you to see if you would like to see this or think this would be a positive development. I mentioned, for example, putting teacher photographs on the report card. It wasn't our idea. We didn't even know about it. It was an idea that we stole from the school districts with which we worked in Canada. But what has surprised us is parents' receptivity to that idea. The parents really feel that it personalized the report card, that they know the teachers when they come to the school. And so to include the teachers' photographs on the report card, many Canadian school districts have it set up too in such a way that even with their online report card, the student's picture is on the report card. Usually on the title page, you have some information about the school and the student there as well. It brings a personal dimension to report card. Not essential, but again, it's an issue that I throw out for your discussion for it overall. Another aspect to it is if we move toward the notion of grading period benchmarks, there are two structures in the way that report cards are organized to report this. The first structure actually lists 4 marking periods in one column sort of for each subject area. And then as the year progresses, then teachers fill out, or their cumulative fill it out as you go through the school year. The second option is actually to have the report card just deal with the current grading period, but have past grading periods tallied at the end of the report card. So that's a structural issue that we need to consider. And so that would mean additional changes in the Infinite Campus format as well. A third, when we were designing our own report card, we tried to determine what parents used to determine what was important in the report card. So we did a little study. And we found out that when parents were looking at a report card, there are 2 factors they considered to determine what's most important. And they are order and space. What comes first is more important what comes later. And what's given more space is considered more important what's given less space. Now, after we did our study and got the results, which we found kind of surprising, we talked to some of the people in the College of Communications. And they told us, well, you dummies, you should have come to us first. People in communication always understand this. Order and space are sort of principles upon which they've always built. It's used in newspaper design. What's above the fold in newspaper design. So they've known about order and space for a long time. But with that in mind, what we did in designing a report card was design a report card in such a way that every subject area has the same amount of space. And so language arts has just as much space as science, it's just as much space as social studies, right? We made that clear right from the start. And if you limit it to like 4 or 5 or 6 possible subcategories within the subject area, that's relatively easy to do. On the elementary level, we also organized a report card to have language arts first, math second, science, social studies, art, music, physical education. We chose it according to the academic priorities that are established by the state. And so that was the order of the report card overall. Now, when it came to the secondary level, then we made this difference. We did not at the secondary level want to show any preference to an academic area. So for the secondary report card, we merged our grading program with the schedule program for the student. So the report card appears in the order of each student's schedule. Now, I know this sounds kind of confusing from a technical perspective. It's really not that difficult to fit up. So in the secondary report card, every subject area, every class has the same amount of space, but it's ordered according to the schedule. So every kid's report card is different. So what comes first is what they have first period, second period, third period, fourth period. And that made the elementary report card different from the secondary report card. But in terms of the changes we need at Infinite Campus, yes, Infinite Campus has to make some changes in order for us to accomplish what we know is going to work best. And if they can't make it, we'll do it on our own. That's why I wanted to involve Jerry in this too, because Jerry is a technological wizard, and he is so good at doing this. And is able to work around the things that Infinite Campus wasn't able to provide for us. So does that make sense? Any questions about that, what that might mean for a reporting device overall? Now, I will share with you one other point, and I just throw this out for you to consider, not that this is the strategy we need to take on. There was some concern expressed about parents and parents' perceptions of this and how we would introduce this to parents. To be honest, in the school districts with which we've worked in other parts of the state, we did not spend a lot of time orienting parents to this process. We didn't. We sent them a little note early on that we were changing the report card and suggested why we were doing it and gave them some rationale and included our purpose statement overall. But here's what we did. The teachers that we brought together during the summer worked to reframe the entire reporting system, and they were using Jerry's format for the report card. For the first 2 marking periods of the coming school year, we sent them 2 report cards. We sent them the new one, and we sent them the traditional Infinite Campus report card. You know what the traditional Infinite Campus report card looks like. It's just a single grade for each subject area, and we sent them our new one. In our new one, we included teacher photographs. In our new one, we broke out the process elements, we put those separately. In our new one, we actually broke down the subject area by the standards overall. We ported those separately by the divisions that we got from academic disciplines. For 2 marking periods, parents got 2 report cards, the traditional Infinite Campus one and our new one. After the second marking period, halfway through the school year, we surveyed all the parents. And we said, look, we don't really have resources to keep sending you 2 any longer. We're going to send you only 1, but you get to pick. Whichever one you want is the one we'll send you. Do you know 98% of our parents chose a new one? It was overwhelming support because it was better. It was just better. And so we have seen amazing parent support. I keep reading about these other states where there's so much parents pushback from this. we didn't see any of that. Now we did see a little bit of pushback in this area. We did move away from percentage grades and we went to just letter grades, A, B, C, D, and F. And we did get some pushback from a few parents, typically of high achieving kids, that said, that A is okay, but I'd really like to know, is that a 98 or a 95? And we just pushed back and said, we're not doing that anymore. We're just not. Call universities don't have percentage grades. We're not going to have to do it either. An A, great, excellent performance. That's what we really want. And they were willing to go along with us on that. We still were able to give the GPA and everything like that worked out. So it was fine. We just got rid of the percentage grades. That was the only aspect, the only critical aspect that we had from all the parents we surveyed from it overall. So you're moving in the right direction. You've got a lot of support on your side. And these changes are things that if we allow parents to know our rationale for doing it, they're going to be strongly supportive of our efforts. Anything else? Any questions or concerns you had? Any guidance that I can offer you for you between now and the next session of things you'd want to take on or issues you'd maybe find helpful to discuss with your staff?
And if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself. As Dr. Gusky said, we are very informal with this. So you don't have to type your question in the chat. We had lots of questions from the secondary folks, and lots of people are taking information back to their school staff. They've thought about ways in which they plan to pilot this with groups, and we heard about that information. So if you have questions, concerns, thoughts that you want to share, now's the time to do it, because Dr. Gusky is by far the expert. If you ask me questions later, I'll do my best to help you, but you definitely want to get the feedback from him.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Hi, Dr. Gusky.
Hi.
I have a few questions, but unfortunately, I missed the first session that you went over with us a few weeks ago.
Okay,
and
no problem.
Were you going to give us time where you were going to kind of go over the standards-based process with us again? I've been fortunate enough to have your expertise shared with me one-on-one when you came to our school, but we're at a point now where we got a few gaps, especially after coming back from, the pandemic. And I just would like your guidance on how to move forward. So I didn't know if I'm moving ahead or if you've already went over some of those things.
Yeah, no, Danielle, that's really great. And you're kind of moving ahead. Our idea was that we first wanted to, because your school is ahead in this process overall. I know you've been talking about these issues for several years, and that's so important. But what we're hoping is once we get this idea of a purpose down, and once we get the idea of pulling out these non-elements, and these are like prerequisites before moving to standards-based. Those two things you have to have down. And even that sample report card I showed you is not a standards-based report card. Once we get this established, then we'll move into the standards-based, and we'll talk about in more detail the difference between the gradebook and the report card, how the report card doesn't have to be 10 pages long, how to summarize that information on a report card, but be able to refer parents to the gradebook for the detail that they need. And we'll also talk about the need to really break down the end of year standards to those benchmarks. And again, all this is coming from surveys we've done with parents and what parents like and what parents have found difficult in making the transition for it. So we want to make sure that we provide that foundation to let what problems you might anticipate going into this, and in how to, in anticipating them, make sure we build the process in such a way that those things don't have to be issues that you deal with at a later time. We're going to deal with them right up front. So once we get this purpose down, and once we get the non-cognitive things pulled out, then we'll turn to that achievement grade and look specifically at the standards-based elements from it and how to make sure we do those really well. So I hope that falls in line with your expectations, and hope you'll be able to advise us too, because you have worked some experience in this too, and have had impact in your school, and again, probably can share with us some of the reactions of parents too, and what they've shared with you about this too. That'll be really helpful in this work.
So we had a couple questions here in the chat, and one of the questions asked, will each school use their own version, or will the district give all elementary schools the same? And then someone asked, could they please receive an email with a new proposed report card in it, just to get an idea of what new report cards might look like. So here's what I will say. So currently there is no proposed report card that's going to be district wide, because one of the things that you have to remember with those types of things, those become policies and those sorts of things. So right now, the great thing about all of this in this pilot is you guys are being given a lot of autonomy and flexibility to do what works for your school. So the first question asking, will it look different from school to school? Yes, because at some schools, they're going to do this, wall to wall, and they're going all in standards-based grading with their whole staff. For some schools, they may say, we're just going to do this with our third grade teachers. You all will have the flexibility to decide how you're going to roll this out at your school levels and what this looks like. Now, I don't know, Dr. Gusky, if you want to share, I know that you shared with our secondary folks the example of the report cards. They had the pictures. I don't want to tell what all the categories were on there, but Dr. Gusky does have some examples of report cards as to how we start with this, because I think one of the things that I've loved about working with him is we're not just jumping in. He's taking us through the steps that we need to get to make sure that we do this successfully. And so I think the report card that he proposed to us really makes it very clear for parents, for students, for staff. So I don't know if you want to share that with this group, Dr. Gusky? Sure, definitely. And Shalon is absolutely right. If you go to my website, it's just tgusky.com. You'll see there's a drop-down menu across the top for resources. And if you hit that, it comes down to articles. If you hit articles, then you'll see a whole section on grading, whole section on assessment, whole section on professional learning, section on mastery learning. If you go to the grading section, you'll see there's an article relatively toward the top. It's an article that I wrote for educational leadership called Breaking Up the Grade. And it talks about that idea of giving multiple grades for that. And in that article, you will see a copy of that Canadian report card that I shared. You'll also see the detailed list of all the different non-cognitive areas we could include, the learning enablers, social emotional learning, and the compliance aspect. They're all included there. And if you wanted to download that and share that with your staff, that would be fine too. I mean, I'd encourage you to do that actually, but you'll see all those examples listed right there. And so you're welcome to just download that and use it in whatever manner you like. You can even just take them to the website and they can download it on their own if they choose to. But I think Shalana makes a really important point. We want to give you the autonomy to do this at your school as you think is going to work best. And I think one of the things that's tremendous about Jefferson County is there's such diversity within the district itself. All the schools, I mean, you deal with different contexts and different student populations, different parent groups overall. And so it might be there'll be adaptations for each. But in addition, we've also gotten feedback from several folks that say we'd like to be able to do something district-wide too. Now, changing report card is something that you pretty much have to do school-wide. I mean, can't, because of the framework of this, the structure of the report card, it's difficult to do it just grade level by grade level. But it doesn't mean every school has to do the same thing. I mean, here in Fayette County, for example, I mean, we're only about a third the size of Jefferson County, maybe 40% or so. But of the high schools here, there are 2 high schools that are using sort of that idea of pulling out those non-achievement factors. They are Bryan Station High School and Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School are both doing it, but the other 4 high schools are not. And that's okay. They've done it school by school rather than district-wide. Now, clearly, if the district does decide to go in that direction, then they have some history here and they have some models they've developed and they know about what works and where they've struggled too.
So I think it's up to you. There's nothing going to be imposed on you, but we're going to develop a framework that if you choose, the district would certainly support you moving in this direction for it overall too. Well, let me say this. I don't want to keep you because I know you have lots of other responsibilities in your schools. But if other issues do come up, if there are questions that you have, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. Again, my email address here at UK is just my name, Guskey, Guskey, and it's at uky.edu. Drop me a line. Any questions or concerns you have, we'll look forward to responding and doing things that would be helpful to you in that area. And if there are questions come up as you work with your staff that you don't know how to address, I can't promise that I do, but don't hesitate to let me know either. So thanks for being a part of this session. We really look forward to supporting you in this effort. Really looking forward to your ideas on how to guide this to make sure it's going to be something that'll work for you. So Shalana, thank you for setting this up. I really appreciate all your help and that you've really been terrific and really appreciate it. So have a great day, everybody. I look forward to seeing you next time.
Dr. Guskey, I don't want to stop. Were you going to share with this group the presentation you shared with our middle and high school folks? Are you going to share that information with them that you just did with the first session?
Oh, the 7 parts. Oh, yes. I thought these people were not a part of that.
No. This is the second session.
Oh,
The second group of people. I didn't want to stop you. You were talking and you had the going and it was great. And I said, I didn't want to interrupt you, but when you started talking about the report card, I was like, well, maybe he thinks that they saw it already today. And I thought you might have talked to the same people. That's okay.
You are right. So
it's Monday. I mean, it's Monday. It was raining this morning. It happens.
I know. Well, I was really just not confused about the schedule. I thought we had everybody together. So let me see here. So if I go here and then boom. So you are going to let me share, right?
Yes, you should be able to share. You are a co-host. So if you are not able to, yep, we can see it.
Okay. All right. Abbreviated version, but this is what we shared with the secondary folks this morning. And here's where it comes from. A lot of school districts throughout our nation today have been working to do grading reform, and a lot of them have failed miserably in those efforts. So what I did was to look at school districts across the nation that have failed, that have gone about this and suffered terribly in their efforts, and why they failed and what they could have done to avoid that. I outlined 7 particular steps, and so here they are. Let's see if we can start here. This is my contact information, and you have this available to you. Talk to you about the ideas that I'm sharing with you are coming from what we know about grading, a book about the research on grading, and the second source is the notion of the Get, Set, Go, which talks about implementation. So that leads me to 7 steps to success. Step number 1, begin with purpose. We've talked about this and why developing your purpose statement is so crucial for this work. The why having to come before the how. School districts that have failed typically started with the report card. They changed the report card and weren't clear about their purpose in the first part. That always has to come first. And that's why we always initiate discussions of grading with these 2 questions. Why are we doing it in the first place? Why are we assigning grades? Why are we using report cards? And then what evidence should be included? I shared in our earlier session about how researchers have asked educators these questions, and they typically come down to these 6. Communicating with parents, communicating with students for self-evaluation, using it to select or group students. You have to have good grades just to be promoted from one grade level to the next. Providing incentives. Students work because the recognition that high grades bring. We use grades when we evaluate programs, hopefully, if the instructional program is working, grades are going up. And then finally, to show evidence of effort and appropriate responsibility on the part of students. The problem is you can't do all these with one device. You've got to establish your priority. Similarly, teachers use different kinds of evidence to determine grades. And these different sources of evidence do vary depending upon grade level and subject area. But when I have the chance to work with any faculty, I would just ask them, tell me how many of these you use to determine the report card grade. And with the faculty, it typically ranges from 2 or 3 to as many as 12 to 15, right? And see, that's where the biggest problems come in. Because in recent years, as we've surveyed parents and students about their concerns about the fairness of grading, equity issues with regard to grading, it always comes down to inconsistency among teachers in the same school. A tremendously challenging issue for parents. Now, to establish that consistency, you have to reach consensus on your purpose. And that means going through this process of disagree and commit. And that means you bring people together, very different perspectives, but we all work together in the same organization. We're sharing these kids, we're sharing the responsibility for these kids. We need to be consistent in it. And so when you address your purpose, then it has to be these 3 elements. What are you trying to communicate? Who's the audience? And how do you want that information to be used? I shared examples of some different purpose statements, right? Here's one that was developed for an elementary school, where they say the purpose of the report card describes students' learning progress to their parents and others based on our school's learning expectations for each grade level. It's intended to inform parents and families about learning successes and to guide improvements when needed. You can see that the elementary folks said our primary audience is parents. Now, and that we find typically that as we move up in grade level, students become a much more important audience for the report card until they get to my level where it's only students. Here's one from a high school where, again, they say, purpose of the report card is to communicate with parents and students about the achievement of specific learning goals. Identifies students' level of progress with regard to those goals, areas of strength, areas where additional time and effort are needed. Now, the one that I shared last time that I particularly favored just because there's so many positive aspects to it is one was developed in an international school in Paris, where they say the primary purpose of grading, not just report card, but grading, effectively communicates student achievement towards specific standards. Right? At this point in time, a grade should reflect what a student knows and is able to do. Students receive separate feedback and evaluation of their learning habits, not be included as part of the academic achievement grade. They print this on the report card. And what I shared about this purpose statement is how powerful it can be when it comes to your policies and practices. Just a simple phrase like at this point in time. By including at this point in time, what that means is they're not going to average. What they're saying to parents and everybody who gets the report cards, we don't care where kids were at the start of the grading period. We care about where they are right now. And we are going to communicate to you the most current evidence we have. Here is where the kids are right now, right? Second thing we talked about was distinguish between the 3 elements of the computerized grading system. This had to do with Infinite Campus in particular. All computerized grading programs are composed of these 3 elements: gradebook, report card, permanent regular transcript. Now, the gradebook is that thing where teachers keep every piece of evidence they gather on students' learning, right? Parents need to know when their kids are completing homework assignments or not, right? Parents need to know how their kids are doing in formative assessments. All that goes into the gradebook. At regular intervals, we summarize that information on a report card. And typically, report cards go home on a quarterly basis every 9 weeks. Then at the end of the year, we have the permanent record. This is the record that follows the child across all schools. Now, the critical element to assessing grading reform is this. You need to distinguish between the gradebook and the report card. Not everything in a gradebook should be a part of students' grades. That's clear. Here is where so many schools have gotten into trouble, right? Parents need to know when their kids are doing homework or not. That doesn't mean you have to count homework as a part of the grade. Parents need to know when their kids are performing well on formative assessments or not. Doesn't mean you need to account formative assessment as part of the grade. Parents need to know if their kids are turning things on time. Doesn't need to be that punctuality of assignments is determined using the grade. And see, the critical element is not everything in the grade book is a part of students' grades. And one of the classic mistakes that districts have made and what's led to their failure is they try to replicate on the report card everything they did in the grade book. No need to do it. Parents have access to teachers' grade books on a 24/7 basis. And that means that you don't need to repeat that information on the report card, right? Now, it also means that if the report card is a summary, how are you going to conduct that summary? Now, different people with different orientations have their own ideas on this. Some will suggest, well, on the report card, then we should, on the report card, report power standards or priority standards or essential standards. The problem is we don't have any evidence that that works. I have looked to find studies on power standards and trying to determine whether that works for anybody. What I've discovered is everybody does differently and nobody has any evidence that it works, right? Plus, it's so much extra work when it's not necessary. Because you see, in every academic discipline, there is a professional teachers organization. Those professional teachers organizations have developed standards and they have organized those standards in strands. They are an excellent way of summarizing on the report card. And so the report card should report according to strands, not according to individual standards. The distinction is this. See, the strands are things you're going to get down to no more than like 4 or 5. 6 is the absolute most, right? You don't have to list all the standards on the report card, right? We see examples here in Kentucky of report cards that are 10 pages long. We are overwhelming parents with information they don't understand and they don't know how to use. We don't have to do that. We can do a much quicker summary and refer parents to the report card, to the actual grade book for the breakdown by the standards. And what that means is that you don't need a report card that looks like this, with all those standards listed there in all these different times. What you need is something that looks more like this. Instead of breaking it down and having 38 language arts standards on a report card, you're going to break down language arts into these 5 areas: reading, writing, speaking, listening, and language, just those 5. The National Council of Teachers of Mathematics has done it for math. The same is true in art, in music, in physical education, in science. 4 or 5 strands, that's all you need. The advantage of reporting according to strands is you can have the same report card at all grade levels. You can have one report card K through 5, because even though the standards change, the strands do not. The strands remain the same. This makes it so much easier for parents, because I can use this report card, breaking it down in this way, and refer parents to the detail of the grade book and not have to have a separate report card at every grade level. Now, in order to do that, these mean number 3, you must disable computer grade calculations. Infinite Campus has this aspect to it that as soon as the teacher enters information, it's used to calculate what the grade is. You've got to turn that off. You've got to disable that. We find that when schools use that, when that is enabled, the kids are checking their phones constantly to determine what their new grade is. Parents are checking their phone to determine what the new grade is multiple times every day. There is nothing in any computerized program that compels kids to care more about points and more about grades and less about learning than that aspect of the program. Just turn it off. We are going to determine the kid's grade we're going to put on a report card, but we don't have to do it on a daily basis. And we're going to let parents know that that's going to be determined, but it's going to reflect our purpose. And so we need to be able to communicate to parents that all of this information is at your disposal, but it's not all of it's going to be used to determine the grade. to get them to focus more on learning and less on points and less on grades. Bringing me to point number 4, and that's limiting percentage grades. Of all the grading systems available to us, the one that is impossible to defend from an ethical, practical, educational perspective is percentage grade system. We talked before about all the differences between them. And the most important to keep in mind is this, as an understanding the difference between measuring something directly and indirectly. And this is why percentage grades don't work. People think that it's finer gradations as we're measuring achievement, or we're measuring something like how well kids are doing in school. But the problem is that having those fine gradations work if you're measuring something directly. If I wanted to measure a kid's height, for example, I'd have them stand against the wall, I'd put that line there, and if my ruler is marked off in half inches, I can only measure their height to the nearest half inch. If my ruler is marked off in quarter inches or eighth inches, more fine gradations, then I can be much more accurate. And that works when you have direct measures. The problem is, most of the things we measure in teaching are not direct measures. They are indirect measures. And indirect measures require what's called inference or judgment. I cannot measure directly a kid's achievement. What I do is I give them a series of tasks to perform, a series of questions to answer, and based on how they perform those tasks or how they answer those questions, I infer a level of achievement, a level of learning from them, and I make a judgment about it. And I can express that in sort of categories. Can I express it in 101 discrete categories? No, you cannot with indirect measures. With indirect measures, 4 or 5, that's about it. We talked about the differences with the scale. In a typical letter grade scale, 5 categories of student performance, 4 levels of passing, 1 level of failure. Kind of makes sense. We're 4 times better at distinguishing levels of passing as we are levels of failure. With percentage grades, scale flips. Now I have a scale, 2/3 of which denote levels of failure. 60 levels of failure. Do we need 60 levels of failure to show the achievement of any kid? Really? There's no reason for it. And plus, with percentage scales, the 0 becomes such a problem because it's such an extreme score. To recover from a 0, a kid has to have 9 perfect papers. Kids aren't able to do that, right? But the problem really isn't the 0. The problem is really percentage grade system. If you get rid of percentages, the problem of zeros goes away, right? We also try to assign percentages to performance, so it's always inaccurate. When we ask teachers to assign a percentage grade to student performance, the average amount of variation there is among equally competent, equally skilled, equally experienced teachers, 10 to 15 percentage points. 10 to 15, right? And that's why when we look at these grading scales, you can see the levels of performance that are associated with each of the scales. When we do studies, when we look at reliability, reliability is consistency. Comparably skilled and knowledgeable teachers looking at the same body of evidence, would they determine the same grade? You know where the cutoff occurs? It's right here. 5 to 6 categories, that's about it. Beyond that, really can't do it with any level of consistency. That's why we always have to record grades in terms of rubrics, not in terms of percentages. If you look at my grade book, everything that goes into my grade book is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Do I have zeros? Yes, I have zeros. And what's a 0? A 0 is a placeholder. 0 means I don't have any evidence. As soon as you get me some evidence, I can change that 0. But going from 0 to passing is 0 to 1, not 0 to 60, right? Give the kid a chance to recover. You can't recover from a 0 in a percentage grade system. But everything that goes into the grade book, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? I have a 10-point quiz. These 10 things could be really important. So I say to my students before we start, look, to get an A on this one, you need 9 out of 10. 9 out of 10 is a minimum, right? Now, next one up, I got some latitude here. Not all these things aren't equally important. And so maybe in this one, you get 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10 is good enough for an A, right? I let them know that ahead of time. It changes with every unit. But what goes into the grade book is the rubric score 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? We talked about changing the way we develop rubrics. This will be crucial for your success too. And it led to, again, school districts failing because of this being a major issue for them. The traditional way we did it is we began in developing rubrics with a level of proficiency. It was typically a level 3. We had a couple of levels leading up to it. In Kentucky, we have novice and apprentice leading to proficient, and we always had a level above. That was the distinguished level, the idea of exemplary performance. And that worked okay at the elementary level because the level above was always easy to establish. If I'm working on 3rd grade standards, it's 4th grade stuff. Problems occurred when districts tried to transition to middle school or high school. Because with middle school or high school, the question was not what do I have to be proficient? It is, what do I have to do to get an A? And that whole approach just killed them. And so to address this, the new approach we're taking to developing as standards is you begin at the top. Describe that top level. If getting a top level means working on 4th grade stuff in 3rd grade, that's fine. Just be clear about it. Let it be known, right? Now, again, I know this runs counter to some of the background that you might have in the development of rubrics. Many of you probably have taken workshops or seminars from like my good friends Bob Marzano or Doug Reeves, and they talk about having that top level being more cognitively complex. And so if your standards deals with application, then you should have a level above that deals with maybe analysis or synthesis. And I say that's great. I'm really fine with that. But you've changed the standard. The standard is going to be whatever you set the top level to be. And I'm fine with doing that. I just want us to be clear about it. Because you see, we're dealing with parents that have always tried to impress upon their child the need to strive for the highest grade possible. And to label that top category the wow experience, you got to blow my socks off, is not good enough. Not good enough. We have to let them know this is what that level looks like. Here is an example of that level work. You know, I used the analogy of Olympic archery and described how in Olympic archery, archers stand 70 meters from a target and they have to hit a target that's just 12 centimeters in diameter. That is really, really challenging. Now, if they did that, how would they ever exceed that? How could you ever go beyond that? And Bob or Doug might say, well, maybe we should move the archer back to 80 meters. Or maybe we should make the target 6 centimeters instead of 12 centimeters. See, that's great. I'm really fine with that. But you've changed the standard. If the standard is hitting a 6 centimeter target at 80 meters, I'm fine with it. Just be clear about it. Let it be known right from the start. So the kids and their parents that are striving for that category know exactly what it is. This is not a new idea. This is what actually Benjamin Bloom told us back in the 1970s. His idea was begin with the model of excellence. Then we talked about developing these rubrics. I shared that I'm really fond of the work of Susan Brookhart in this area, who indicates that there are 2 aspects to any rubric: a set of criteria for the student's work, and then descriptions of the levels of quality within each of those criteria. So it basically comes down to these 2 things. Your set of criteria for a piece of work, and then graduated levels of quality from poor to excellent within each. But I also stress that we now have some magic numbers associated with these. That in evaluating any performance, any piece of student work, you can't evaluate it in terms of 10 criteria. It loses its value as a learning tool. We've got to get it down to no more than about 4 or 5, right? Beyond that, it loses its value as a learning tool. Kids can't keep track of 10 things. They can keep track of 3 or 4 things. Now, that means that I don't always have to use the same criteria, but I have to keep the number limited in that way. So I use the example, if I'm trying to teach composition, my kids do a writing sample for me, I might evaluate that composition in terms of criteria 1, 2, 3, and 4. Second composition, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Third composition, well, you know, everybody has pretty much got 1 down. So maybe the third composition I could do 2, 3, 4, and 5. Fifth composition, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, everybody pretty much has 2 down. So the fifth composition I could do 3, 4, 5, and 6. So over a grading period, I could maybe cover 10 criteria, but for each individual performance, got to get down to no more than 3 or 4. Now, Sue also makes the point that Rubrics don't actually judge performance, but they describe performance. You need to keep that in mind. And she makes the distinction between what she calls compliance rubrics and learning rubrics. A lot of you have been interested in this notion of like a single dimension rubric or a single criteria rubric. And that really comes down to compliance. You're just indicating, are they there or not? You're not interested in levels of quality, right? Here's an example of a compliance rubric, right? A poster project, elementary level, 4 things I wanted the kids to have: facts, graphics, grammar, and neatness. Now you can see from some to none. It's a frequency count. Did you do it or not? Versus a learning rubric where I'm actually looking at differences in quality and I'm inferring the differences in quality as an expert. I'm the teacher, I'm the expert. I'm giving them some feedback on this. Here we have a writing project with 3 criteria: content, reasoning and evidence, and clarity with division of quality. When it comes to developing those levels of quality, I recommend the work of Judy Arter and Jay McTighe, who talk about starting with your model of excellence. That's the yes, bottom category of no, but the in-between categories. No, it really wasn't what we want, but there's some redeeming factors to it. To the yes category, yes, but there's just a few things missing, a few things you got to clear up yet, right? Simplistic works pretty well. Some reasons for doing it: powerful tools for teaching. You teach the kids the rubric as a part of the class. When you do that, they become thoughtful judges of their own work. It reduces the amount of time you spend with it because what you get from them initially is better. Allows you to accommodate differences for kids. The kids that are really good in writing but don't understand the content versus the kid who understands the content but has difficulty in expressing it in written form. Easy to explain to kids and improves objectivity. Objectivity does not imply everybody agrees on the same criteria. Improving objectivity means we're consistent in the criteria we're employing from 5 o'clock in the evening to 10 o'clock in the evening. And finally, now, this will be instrumental for your work. To deconstruct the end of year standards, determine grading period benchmarks. Here's what it implies. When the standards movement was first begun, all of the standards were end of year standards for the elementary level. They were core standards for secondary level. We were convinced with excellent instruction that the students would be demonstrating their mastery on these different standards at the end of the school year. So at the end of the school year, we report card with all filled with 4s. That made sense to us. The problem was the report card did not go home just at the end of the year. The report card went home after the first 9 weeks. After the first 9 weeks, the kids were just starting on the standards. So we sent the report card home full with the 1s and 2s. That made sense to us. It did not make sense to parents. See, we're dealing with parents that are trying to impress upon their child the need to bring home the highest grade possible. To them, 1s and 2s were failing grades. We tried to defend that and say, no, 1 and 2, that's about where we'd expect them to be right now. But the parents' question was, if my child was having trouble, what grade would you give them? A 1 or a 2? Well, see, I can't tell if my kid's on track or my kid's having trouble. And so the remedy to that is actually develop grading period benchmarks. Where do we want the kids to be after the first quarter? This is extra work. It does require teachers going out of their way to say, here is where we'd expect them to be at the end of the first quarter, and actually report their progress in terms of those expectations, those grading period benchmarks. See, students and their parents want to know if they're on track at that time. And that means being able to know where they are and whether that is as we would expect. The grading period benchmarks allow us to communicate that. And the last of the 7 points, again, multiple grades. To actually distinguish between product, process, and progress criteria. Product, culminating destinations of learning. Process, behaviors that enable learning. Homework is a learning enabler. Formative assessments are a learning enabler, right? Effort is a learning enabler. And engagement is a learning enabler. And then progress, which just means how much they've gained. Now, the problems occur when we combine these all into one grade. And because then it can't be interpreted, right? Here's an example of Canadian report card that is not standards-based. All they did on this report card was pull out those non-achievement factors. Now, please note, this is actually a high school report card. It is not standards-based because there are no standards listed here. All they did was to pull out those non-cognitive aspects from the achievement grade. Nobody told teachers how to come up with the achievement grade. They let the teachers do that on their own. They just said, pull the non-achievement factors out. And in this school, they chose participation, homework, punctuality, and effort. When it comes to these process elements, they fall into these three categories: learning enablers, social emotional learning, and in compliance. Here's a more extended list. And you can download this list from the website. The article, if you go onto the website, resources, articles, grading, breaking up the grade, it includes this list for you. Now, we do not have evidence at this time to indicate among these what is most important for kids' success in school or in their life afterwards. We're just starting to study that. We do know you can't do it all. And so what the faculty of every school has to do is determine among these things, what do you think is most important, right? And it can be some combination. You might have some compliance things, some learning enablers, and some social emotional learning. But to succeed, you've got to get it down no more than 4 or 5. You don't want to create a bookkeeping nightmare for teachers. Once you've established the 4 or 5 you want, then you have to develop clear and concise rubrics for it. You have to ensure developmental consistency with those rubrics. Maybe what collaboration looks like in a kindergarten class is different from what it would look like in a 4th or 5th grade class, and that's okay. We just need to be clear about it. And finally, describe this in your purpose statement. So again, to take you back to the purpose statement for the American School in Paris, they added this sentence: students receive separate feedback and evaluation of what they call their learning habits, which will not be included in their academic achievement grades. Pull those factors out, report them separately. And when you do that, it brings meaningfulness to the grade, and it brings tremendously enhanced equity to grades, because sometimes kids don't control those non-achievement factors, or they're due to factors over which the kids do not have control, right? And so, to review quickly, 7 steps to success. Number 1, begin with purpose. Number 2, distinguish the 3 elements of the computerized grading system and make sure to keep them separate. Not everything that goes in the gradebook has to be part of the grade. You want to disable the computer grade calculations. Give the information to parents, just don't let the computer be calculated and graded until you as a teacher determines time. We want to eliminate percentage grades because we just can't defend them. Change the way we develop rubrics, starting with the model of excellence and moving down. Deconstruct end-of-year standards to determine grading period benchmarks, and finally, multiple grades. A whole lot in a very short period of time. And I said with the high school folks, you're probably feeling like this. There's a lot to take on, right? But what are your questions? Are there issues here that don't make sense? Is there anything that I can explain in greater detail to try to make sense of it? And I apologize. I mistook the nature of our session today. I thought we were doing something similar to our last time where we had elementary and secondary folks together. I didn't know we were dividing it in this way today. So I'll make sure I'm more conscious of that next time rather than misleading you as I did earlier. But are there issues that came up? Are there things that I could try to explain in any greater detail? Things that haven't made sense?
We've got a hand raised. Sarah, you
Oh,
go ahead and
sure.
unmute and you're fine.
I just had a question and potentially something that schools or teachers might run into. So one of the things that I like that you said that we're going to have to establish benchmarks for the
Yes.
standards.
Mhm.
So I'm familiar mostly with 2nd grade of taught that for 5 years, and one of the second grade standards is add and subtract fluently, within 100 with word problems, missing add-ins, etc.
Right.
So we, at this year, when we were kind of deconstructing the standard, we did what you had suggested. We said, by the first 9 weeks, we really want them to add and subtract fluently within 20.
Okay.
And then by the second, 50, and then 75, and then to 100.
Okay.
But what happened was that we had some feedback that wasn't, that wasn't the student mastering the standard, and so we couldn't list that as like a goal. I just kind of wanted to bring that up just as a conversation piece, I guess, or what we can do to prevent that, because I think that kind of what we were doing might be in alignment with what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I just kind of wanted to ask maybe for some suggestions or clarification on that.
Yeah, no, Sarah, I think you're right on track. And true. I mean, it could be the case that if kids meet the sort of benchmark at the first marking period, they haven't mastered the standard yet. But we want to ensure in what we communicate to parents that they're on track. And this is where I would expect them to be at this time. And so that's all the major concern of parents is, if my kid is having trouble, I want to know as soon as possible. And I don't want them to get to the end of the school year and for you to tell me they're not making it. And so I think what you're doing is exactly what we need to do. And true, if they meet the benchmark, that doesn't mean they've met the standard. They've met the benchmark of where we expect them to be at this time. And that means that according to our judgment, they are on track to really be able to be there by the end of the school year. So I think what you're doing is exactly what we need to do. That's establishing a benchmark. It lets us know if they're here, then they're really on track to be there at the end of the year. And if they're not here, then there needs to be some intervention. We need to provide some special assistance for these kids. That's exactly what parents want to know. And so I think what you're doing is exactly what needs to be done. It is some extra work because we're talking about all of our standards being broken down in those same ways. But it's going to put you on a very positive track with your parents, because that's exactly the information they want to understand. Parents also understand that it would then be possible for grades to go down in the second marking period, that they could make a progress for the first marking period, but they're faltering a bit for the second. And that would be okay. That's the system in which parents grew up. They understand that. And so they will be aligned with you and they will support efforts as you move in this direction. But it does take extra work on your part to determine exactly what those benchmarks should be. Once you do that, though, you're really doing exactly what parents find most helpful. So I would encourage you to keep up with that. I think you're right on track.
Dr. Gusky, with that, the question that I have with that is, if as a school, which I guess somebody just said that in the chat, that they have things that we can look at to support us, all not doing something totally different. Like, it needs to be things that are spoken where each school knows, because these grade level standards are not supposed to be mastered until the end of the year, then it is going to be some work for your teacher teams to go through and break that standard down by quarters to say where they should be technically at this point to give benchmarks. But I guess then too, we don't want to run into, as a district, everybody creating their own benchmark, because then if you switch schools and we know, like, the way that our kids move, what your benchmark was, if you were supposed to be counting 1 to 50 this quarter, and we put it as 1 to 75 or whatever. I mean, that's just something too, I think, as a district, Dr. Foster, that we would probably need to talk about, so we all wouldn't be all over the place.
Yeah, that's a really important point, Danielle, and you're right. Michelle and I have actually talked about this, and she recognizes that instead of everybody having to create your own wheel, let's get some really smart people together and develop one that everybody could use. And that way we can have some consistency, we can economize our work efforts, we can lessen the burden of any individual teacher by bringing that kind of consistency to it overall. And allow teachers some latitude within it too, that it doesn't have to be sort of carved in stone, but at least it has some general guidelines. So if my kids aren't there, I know that I have to do some changing, and I have to build up some things to make sure that they're really going to be on track for the end of the year. And I think that Michelle is really looking toward this, trying to find ways to organize efforts sort of district wide, bring smart people together from the different schools to establish those benchmarks, and then communicate them to everybody so we can all be on the same track.
And that's so important what you just said, Dr. Guskey. And I've made a note of that, and I'm gonna, I'll take that back and share with our instructional cabinet. But that's part of the reason why we have this cohort right now, right? We started with 40 schools, and I told Dr. Guskey today, I said, we have 61 schools now, right? We are trying to get as many people together as thought partners so that we can figure out how this is going to best benefit the kids in JCPS. And, you know, in checking the sheets, someone had asked about, you know, if the report cards don't look the same, like, can this be liability for our school administrators? Well, the great thing about the pilot part of this is, you know, policy is policy. And I think I referred to the policy earlier. And if I didn't, I should have, because Jan and I are on that grading committee. And part of what we are going to do with that grading committee is we're going to use the work from this cohort to help us make sure that our work is aligned. But policy is policy, and everybody will continue to follow the policy. But the great thing about that report card that Dr. Guskey just shared is that we already have schools in our district who had examples of report cards that they'd used. And Dr. Guskey had asked, you know, could we get people to share? I think that Daniil's school has one, because I think Brittany has shared with me a lot of the things from their standards-based, their drive. Norton Commons has one. So we have schools who've already started doing the work, but we want to put all these thoughts together, figure out what's working, what doesn't work. And I think that talking about those benchmarks is really super important, because if we can get people doing things with consistency, it's going to be better for our kids.
Yeah. Well, and the other advantage too there, Shalonda, and you made this point so well, if I'm a new second grade teacher and I'm thinking about developing those benchmarks, I really want to know if my expectations would align with like Sarah's expectations for her kids. Maybe I'm not expecting enough, or maybe I'm expecting too much. And so if we can work together bring this in and use our experience and our thoughtfulness in developing these, that it can be a guide for all teachers to use. And if my kids aren't there at first 9 weeks, then I know I have to do some things from a teacher's perspective to pick up my pace, or otherwise my kids may not be there at the end of the year. But if I have that as a guideline, and if we can do that district-wide, it will provide every teacher, especially for new teachers coming in, a framework that they'll be able to use to determine whether their instructional pace is falling in line with what is expected, and it would really put kids on track to be mastering those skills by the end of the year.
Dr. Guskey, my other question, you showed an example of the report card, and you had the different sections. And you said under language arts, you know, it would be speaking, writing, listening.
Yes.
When I saw that, it made my heart beat a little bit fast, because from my understanding, I thought when you explained to us the first time, the whole purpose of the standards base was to show parents what kids have learned or mastered at this time. So to me, what you showed us went back to a broad picture, and went away from the specific points of the essential standards, that we have focused on our report card now. Am I making sense what I'm saying?
No, you really are, Danielle, and thank you. No, that makes great sense, and you're absolutely right. The idea was that we were trying to do two things. The first of all, to clarify the communication, and second, to make things easier for teachers. If teachers are recording student progress and individual standards in the gradebook, there's no need for them to replicate that on a report card. The report card is the summary. And so instead of listing all the different standards on the gradebook, we just divide it into those strands. And that way I can let parents know, and this is so important, especially for kids that have learning needs or English learners. They might be doing really great in speaking, but their reading is a little bit off. And I could break down the standards accordingly. If I want to give them the detail of the individual standards, I refer them to the gradebook, because they have that. They can look at the teacher's gradebook and get all that information, individual standards there. But the report card is more of a summary on broader categories. We don't have to develop the categories because our academic disciplines have done it. But it's a way to provide that overall summary to see the general areas of strength or general areas of weakness for each particular student. It also helps us understand that these strengths and weaknesses are not attributable to a child, but attributable to an area of development in this particular academic discipline. I mean, so it's not that you are, learning disabled overall, but you have certain areas where you have strength and certain areas of your weaknesses. If I can channel them in those categories, then it helps me understand that the labels attached to the academic discipline, not to the kid. And so I don't want to label kids in this way. I just want to say, here are your areas of strength and here are your areas of weakness, and then the specifics within each of those. And the final advantage is when you report by strands, same report card at all grade levels. That's a tremendous advantage for parents, because then they don't have to adjust to everything. Even though the grade book will look different and the grade book has all the individual standards in it, report card stays the same. So Shalonda, what do you think? I again apologize for my misunderstanding about the format for it. I know we went through these 7 issues rather quickly, and we did spend a bit more time on it with our earlier group of the secondary educators. But they're being a part of both sessions. Is there anything that I missed? Anything that I should explain to elementary folks that I haven't done as clearly this time?
No, I think you hit everything. I think that, when we come back our next time, it was, homework for this time, but we've had so many new schools that have come and join us. We want to make sure that everybody has their purpose statements ready to go, because I think that that's going to be one of the key things for us. And I was sharing with someone earlier, they asked about the purpose statements and how we could, collect all those and use those. And I said, ideally, the hope is, as Dr. Gusky continues to provide new knowledge to our cohort, those purpose statements are going to shift and they're going to grow, and they're really going to be individualized to the schools. You guys are going to see things that you didn't see, or think about things that you hadn't thought about, previously. I know a lot of people came in thinking, this was just about a new report card and Infinite Campus. But I think Dr. Gusky has shared with us that it's about so much more. The report card is just one part of it. And really it's kind of a tiny part of it when you look at it, because as he shared with us, just those 7 things there, getting rid of those percentages. And I mean, there are so many steps that we have to take before we even get to that point. But the first one is making sure that as a team, you guys have a clear purpose for what does grading look like at your school. And sometimes when I hear the word grade, I cringe, Dr. Gusky, and I know you probably don't want to hear that, but I cringe because, I think about it as a parent and my child, and, what she sees when she sees grades. But hearing from this group, I see that they understand that it's more than just about letters and numbers, but it's about how we're communicating, and it's about making sure that we're making a better tomorrow for our kids. So like I said, I think you've hit all the points very nicely.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And again, just to remember, we do have another session. Our next session, I think, is coming up on November 15. The assignment between now and then is to, number 1, work with your team at your school to come up with a purpose statement, something that you like, and then we're going to use that time to share those purpose statements and see if how much consistency there is. I think we're going to discover there's lots, and maybe come up with a purpose statement that we could have consistent across all elementary schools in district. If a purpose statement's a little different from middle school and high school, that would be okay. And the second part of it is then to look at those non-cognitive things and what you would see pulling out. What do you think is most important? And if it is the case, and you can discuss this with your team, that maybe the K2 people see some things differently from like the 3 to 5 people, that would be okay. We find often kindergarten is kind of its unique beast and requires a slightly different approach. But we want the second part of the assignment is to come up with those non-cognitive things that you would like to pull out and report separately on the report card and on the permanent record. So those 2 things are your assignment for next time. If you want additional guidance on that, you can look for resources on the website and also in the book on Get Set Go. You'll find their chapters in each of those there too. So again, Shalana, thank you so much for your great coordination during this time and for steering me straight. I really appreciate it. You helped me get back on track. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time.